آزادی بیان
言论自由
Free speech.
Welcome everybody to another free speech debate event here at Oxford University. If you could please put your mobile phones to silent. If you're tempted to tweet, the hashtag is caps FSD Manji. We're delighted to have with us Irshad Manji, who is a really exceptional figure in the debate in Islam and around Islam, someone who represents very bravely and clearly, in the face of both death threats and abuse and condescension, not least the last, a version of Islam that is entirely compatible with the essentials of a liberal democracy and a liberal constitutional state. And that is obviously something which is not absolutely universal in the world of Islam. Our focus today is on what in English we call free speech, that is actually to say freedom of expression. So let me just say two things about the title. First of all, when it says how should we, open brackets, not talk about Islam, by talk we mean all forms of expression. Signs, movies, performances, dare I mention cartoons, and so on. That's rather obvious. Secondly, the title begs the obvious question, who are we in that sentence? And that is precisely one of the things we want to talk about. Irshad Manji became very well known through the publication of her book, The Trouble with Islam Today. She won several awards, including Oprah Winfrey's first Chutzpah Award for boldness. She is here in connection with the publication of her latest book, Allah, Liberty and Love, copies of which will be available afterwards. And she leads the Moral Courage project at New York University. What's going to happen is that Irshad is going to say a few opening words, then we're going to get into a conversation for about 30-40 minutes, and then it'll be open for discussion. Irshad.
Well, let me first say I am thrilled that we have a full house this evening. And I'm thrilled about that because I'd like to believe that this represents diversity of thought, and that it'll lead to a very feisty discussion, which is what I do. And so please do it with me this evening. And I also want you to know, as a couple of folks already do, that Timothy and I have spent about 4 years, I think it would be fair to say, trying to sync up our schedules so that we can finally get together and have a conversation. I don't just mean public conversation. We even tried to have private conversations. And every time he came to the United States or Canada, I was on a different continent, and vice versa to your country. So this is a real thrill to finally fulfill that aspiration, Tim. And he did mention, I'll start off formally speaking with just a few words, and truly it'll be no more than I think a 5 or 6 minute statement, which I hope will give you some context from about where I'm coming from. Let me begin with a story. A few years ago, a group of offended Muslims protested my forthcoming visit to their university in New Jersey, in the United States. One of the offended Muslims branded me a fascist. Rather than be intimidated by this and pull my invitation, as others have, the religious studies professor hosting the event did two things. First, he permitted the Muslim protesters to circulate anti-Irshad pamphlets and brochures at the event itself. And second, the host gave these protesters pride of place during the question and answer session. So by finding a creative response to offense, everybody's freedom of expression won. With a slight hitch. Behind closed doors, the especially offended Muslim who called me a fascist demanded that in the next iteration of my book, The Trouble with Islam Today, I edit out, I censor certain passages that he didn't like. At which point I had to wonder, which one of us is the real fascist now? But of course, that question has more depth to it than a cheap shot might suggest. What I'm really meaning to say by asking that question is that diversity is not merely about different religions and different skin tones. Diversity is also about different ideas. And different ideas will naturally offend different people. So offense is not a problem to be avoided at any price in the name of diversity. Rather, offense is the price of honest diversity. And I'm going to push this idea a little bit further. Since different ideas are bound to offend different people, should we all just clam up since we're going to be offending each other anyway? Well, first of all, I'm not capable of clamming up, so that's not going to work. Not for me, at any rate. But maybe more seriously, if we silence ourselves for fear of offending, then we, I think, consign ourselves to becoming relativists. And a relativist is somebody who falls for anything because she stands for nothing. I argue in Allah, Liberty, and Love that the better approach, the more constructive approach to diversity is to strive to become pluralists. A pluralist makes judgments every day about what's right and wrong, what's true and false, what's conscionable and unconscionable. Pluralists make judgments, but we make those judgments with humility, acknowledging that any judgment will necessarily be provisional, temporary, contingent upon having more experiences in life and hearing better arguments down the road. Hence the centrality, the sheer importance of free speech. And this brings me to a couple of very, very quick comments about controversial themes that I'm sure we'll get into this evening. The Prophet Muhammad cartoon crisis. As many of you may remember, in 2006, a worldwide brouhaha erupted when Jyllands-Posten, a then obscure Danish newspaper, published caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, I took a pro-freedom stance, which I can explain in greater detail when the time is right. But the point I want to make here is that in response, many Muslims wrote me the most nasty, the most vile emails you could imagine. And what seemed to elude them is that they were using their liberties to argue against liberty itself. And so the message for these folks was that your freedom depends on letting others enjoy their freedom. And that then brings me to a second controversial topic, the still raging debate about the so-called Ground Zero Mosque in the city in which I live and teach, New York. What I have found so fascinating about that issue is that groups of people, pro and con, tend to take sides based not on the merit of the project itself, but rather on how offended they feel by people who hold the opposite view. so that both pro and con camps become manipulated by the culture of offense. And I believe, perhaps naively, but that's what we're here to discuss, I believe that most of us, if not all of us, are capable of better, are capable of using our freedoms in more constructive ways. For example, by asking questions out loud. And one of the questions I've asked about that particular project, the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, is, will there be segregation between women and men in the mosque at any time of the day or night? If so, then I already know that what is being practiced there is not what the imam who formerly fronted this project called the most modern, the most progressive and democratic form of Islam you can imagine. No, what is being practiced there in the case of segregation is tribal culture. And on that basis alone, meaning the merits of the project, I already know I oppose it. But that judgment comes by asking questions about it and not about people who take an opposite point of view. I want to say one final thing about questions. I realize that in all of my work, I ask questions that make both Muslims and non-Muslims quite uncomfortable. But I do this, I think, for a good reason. I have learned over the last decade and more that when people are told to shut up in order to respect diversity, their suspicions about the so-called other only rise. Where is our vaunted diversity then? And that's why I would argue the word respect needs to be carefully re-examined. These days, the phrase respect me has become a euphemism for don't challenge me. I believe that when we avoid asking each other, as you will me, I'm sure, pointed, searching, and uncomfortable questions, we, at least implicitly, wind up infantilizing one another, treating each other as children. That, to me, is not respect. That is disrespect. It's also dishonest diversity. And with those opening words, I'll turn it over to Professor Garton-Ash.
Thank you very much, Irshad. I think both Isaiah Berlin and Ralph Dahrendorf would be cheering from wherever they are that sterling cry for open liberal pluralism and living with conflict, with regulated conflict. Let me pick up immediately where you left off. We have on the website 10 draft principles for discussion, and they are drafts. They're drafts to be debated. And the one on religion, which we spent a lot of time working on, reads, and I know you've had a look at it, we respect the believer, but not necessarily the content of the belief. And then we unpick that, because of course everything depends on how you use the word respect. And in academic terms, it's a distinction between what has been called recognition respect and appraisal respect. That is to say, I fully recognize you as a human being with equal worth, liberty, and dignity, while also I may consider that what you believe is a load of complete baloney. And feel free to say that. Would you subscribe to that principle in that understanding of the word respect?
Yes, I would. I personally would. Now, as you rightly pointed out in a very generous way, my beliefs aren't exactly universal among Muslims. And one very sort of visceral example of where this principle that you've just articulated, we respect the believer, but reserve the right to call his or her beliefs baloney, where that principle goes wrong for many Muslims is captured in the criticism that I received for the title of my previous book, The Trouble with Islam, as it first was titled. Later, clarified as the trouble with Islam today. But that wasn't enough of a clarification for most Muslims who cared to engage about this, because their real criticism was, Irshad, there is no trouble with Islam. There is trouble with Muslims. And for many of my co-religionists, that's a major distinction that contradicts the Enlightenment tradition. That is to say, they were announcing that we are open to being criticized because as believers, we are the imperfect ones. We are the ones who are not living up to the better angels of Islam. But don't say that there's trouble within Islam itself, because Islam is perfect. It is we who are not. Now, I can take issue with the notion that Islam is perfect. After all, Islam, like culture, is an organized system by which to do certain things, and it is human beings that create the organizing or the organization. It is not God that gives us the organizing structures. Principles, perhaps, I can take that leap of faith, but not the organizing structures, which are human-made and therefore imperfect. However, let's put that aside for just a second. What I found so disingenuous, Timothy, about that statement that was being made to me by Muslims is that many of them who criticized criticizing the idea rather than the holder of the idea would be the first people to take my dissident derriere to court and sue me for fear-mongering against an identifiable group of people if I had entitled my book, The Trouble with Muslims Today. Everybody knows this. This is politics. It's hardly a surprise that in matters of faith, politics would be shot through. But what I find revealing is that in bringing this argument to my critics, I have never received any response denying that this is what would happen. And I, again, like to point out that, a lawsuit would have been great for book sales. Okay? Not so good, however, for sincere conversations with my fellow Muslims. So, very important to recognize that in the context from which we speak, in the cultural context from which we speak, the idea, which seems so common sense, because here it is, that ideas can be criticized quite legitimately, but those who hold those ideas are not, their dignity is not undermined by criticism of their ideas. Many Muslims, including here in the West, would argue the exact opposite when it comes to Islam. So there's a big wrinkle that needs to be dealt with in your principles.
Well, let's unfold the wrinkle, if a wrinkle can be unfolded. Right. Because you mentioned being taken to court, and you mentioned the word dignity. Yeah. Now, we have with us in the room Jeremy Waldron, who, professor of social and political theory in this university, who has just written a fascinating book arguing the case for hate speech legislation. Roughly speaking, I'll leave it to him to characterize it precisely, on the grounds of the dignitarian harm which is done by images and words. And I wanted us to clarify your position on the law, because as I read your new book, you're almost beyond the First Amendment. You not only make the classical First Amendment statement, the answer to bad speech is more speech, right. You say YouTube shouldn't have taken down a death threat against you, which was up on YouTube, which is an extraordinary thing to say, because even in the First Amendment tradition, direct death threats are illegal. So is there nothing you would ban by law?
Correct. Nothing
at all?
Nothing.
Direct threats of personal violence?
I would not ban the publication of such things.
Wow.
And for me, there's a simple reason behind all of this. those of us who advocate for what some would call liberal, others would call progressive values, what I, simply call modernity, we need to know what we're up against. And what I explained in Allah, Liberty, and Love, by way of inviting YouTube to repost that death threat against me, what I said was that by deleting the roughest edges of this debate, we become, in many ways, willfully blind to all that is involved in fighting for individual liberty and freedom of expression and universal human rights and pluralism of peaceful ideas. The moment we allow ourselves then, to become that negligent about what the odds are and how, as the Quran would call it, how steep the uphill trek to moral courage is, it's too easy then to become shocked, surprised, and silenced by the backlash that will invariably come your way when you argue for these unpopular positions.
But that's a very demanding message,
it's a high
isn't it?
standard.
I mean, it's asking, in a sense, it's asking people to be heroes. What if people are, feel they belong to a vulnerable minority in a threatening environment, and they're not very brave, which a lot of people aren't?
Well, I don't think it is asking people to be heroes, Tim. Some people are capable of that and aspire to that even, and God bless them. But most people don't see themselves as such, and frankly don't need to be heroes in order to push the parameters of openness within democratic societies. I'll give you one example, a woman by the name of Lillian Smith, who most Americans have never heard of because her story is not taught, and it should be. She was a white Southern woman in the 1930s and 40s who openly, publicly, and repeatedly called for an end to racial segregation. And she was mocked, condescended to, despised as a radical and as an extremist by her fellow liberal white Southerners. Now, on the basis of the response that she received, you'd never think that this woman had any influence. But somebody was listening, and his name was Martin Luther King Jr. And a full generation after Lillian Smith, MLK cited her as one of his teachers. She wasn't a hero, and certainly would not have been considered one in her time. But clearly, by using her voice, regardless of the fact that sometimes she had to be snuck onto white-only university campuses because she was hated so much by white Georgians, by using the voice in the way that she did, what she became was this is her phrase that she taught to MLK, she became a creative extremist, not a destructive one, but one who fought with love and thereby added value to the discussion and the debate. His intention, murderous intention, is made known. That is when it can be acted upon. That is to say, that is when, for example, law enforcement can act upon it in order to ensure, to the degree that anybody can, that you remain relatively safe. I would much rather know that somebody in this room wants to kill me and intends to kill me than to not know that they intend to do that. Because they're going to try anyway if that's what they really want to do. I want to be given the heads up about that.
Yeah. Well, the English are far too polite to do that then.
Well, no kidding. And can I just say that I found that out, and I tell this story, as you can see, because I'm flipping through the book. I found that out when a university professor from the University of London told me in a private conversation, if you believe that anything you say can touch and set off raw sensitivities. Don't say it. And I was flabbergasted by that comment, because that would suggest, for example, that Galileo ought not to have said what he said. It would suggest that a woman by the name of Hissa Hilal in Saudi Arabia, a woman who made it to the final round of this, you probably heard about the show, Poet of Millions, sort of an American Idol type show. She knew that her poem about the disastrous evil of suicide bombers would set off all kinds of people. And the internet went crazy, the blogosphere went crazy after she delivered her poem against suicide bombers. But would this university professor have suggested that she should not stand up for those Muslims who disagree with suicide bombing simply because those who agree with it or are indifferent to it would somehow be outraged by her poem? Is it to say that Elie Wiesel, when he was helping to launch the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., should not have turned his head back to where President Clinton was sitting and said, about Bosnia, Mr. President, we cannot not do something? When Professor Wiesel said those very simple words, he upset a great many Jews in the audience who felt that this hallowed ground of the Holocaust Museum should not be used as a platform for anything but sanctifying the memory of the Holocaust against Jews. And yet, precisely because Elie Wiesel was willing to create upset, the President of the United States was embarrassed enough to consider and ultimately act upon humanitarian intervention on behalf of Muslims. You don't need more examples. My point simply being, that I don't know of any form of progress, social, moral, or otherwise, that comes from the unwillingness to ruffle feathers where necessary.
Let me leave that one in the room. I'm sure people will want to come back to it, particularly on the point of whether publication across the internet does not actually increase the direct threat of violence, but also on the distinction between legislation on the basis of violence and simply on the basis of dignitary harms. By the way, I think, are there any seats left at the back there? Can anyone see a spare seat? No, may I invite, there is some floor. There's a seat there. Yes, talking along there. So let me move on to another area, just to open up a series of threads, as we might say.
As opposed to threats.
Threads as opposed to threats, indeed. Which is, assume the we in our title means non-Muslims. And so the we is how non-Muslims speak about Islam / about Muslims. I'm going to leave the Danish cartoons. I mean, you have an interesting discussion of them. I'm sure we'll come back to them, but some of us have Danish cartoon exhaustion. Let me take it quite different. I know you've read the Mark Thompson interview on the website.
Right.
Now, this is the Director General of the BBC, and it's a fascinating interview. The Director General of the BBC, Mark Thompson, is a devout Catholic. He allowed the broadcasting of Jerry Springer the opera, which has a very offensive representation of Jesus Christ. And I said to him, surely the BBC would not have broadcast something comparably satirical about the Prophet Muhammad. To which, after a moment's hesitation, he said, yes, I think that's right. And then he gave 3 reasons, basically. Number one was one I pushed him on, which is, it's a threat of violence. I mean, he rather wonderfully said, let me see if I can find the exact words, because it was rather nicely put. Let me see if I can see it here. Yes, he said, It's the threat of violence, he says, obviously from Muslims. Well, clearly it's a very notable move in the game. I mean without question. And then says Mark, I complain in the strongest possible terms is different from I complain in the strongest possible terms and I'm loading my AK-47 as I write. So that's reason number one, the threat of violence. But then he gives two other reasons. I'd like you to comment on them both. One is, he says, look, Christianity in Britain is the established church. It has broad shoulders. Muslims are a vulnerable minority. You cannot editorially, as a national public service broadcaster, apply exactly the same standard to the secure majority and the vulnerable minority. So argument number one is vulnerable minority. Okay. Yeah, we've talked about violence. Yep. Argument number two, this is very interesting. Mark Thompson, Director General of the BBC, as a devout Christian, says, listen, as a realist in religion, someone who believes in the reality of their religious belief, you've got to understand the impact of something like the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. Yeah, the impact of blasphemy. He says it has the emotional force of a piece of grotesque child pornography. And that secular liberals, like most of the people who work at the BBC, that's me speaking, not Mark, don't get that sense of profound hurt that truly religious people have. So I wonder if you could comment on both Mark Thompson's points. That's vulnerable minorities and then the sense of real hurt.
Mm-hmm. Can I take them in reverse order?
Sure.
The sense of hurt. Every Muslim will tell you, both behind closed doors and outside of those doors, that as Muslims we are to worship God, not God's self-appointed ambassadors. Every Muslim will acknowledge, when pushed, Prophet Muhammad is not God. Many Christians believe Jesus Christ is God. And yet, in offensive depictions of Christ, you will still not get the kind of hostility, and in some cases violence, that Muslims will express over somebody who is manifestly, within mainstream Islam, not God. So the sense of hurt is something that I don't think can honestly be traced back to who is being caricatured or depicted. I think that it is a ploy, this sense of hurt. And moreover, I will say this, that then brings me to the earlier point about vulnerable minorities. I think it is too easy, and I listened to Mark Thompson's interview more than once, 3 times actually, and couldn't shake the feeling that he was assuming that being offended is the same thing as being discriminated against. And it's not. One can be offended by having to abide by the same standards as everybody else. For example, I tell the story in Allah, Liberty, and Love, and let me just read from it very briefly. At the World Economic Forum in January 2006, just before the Danish cartoon crisis, I attended a session about the US religious right. A cartoonist satirized one of America's most influential Christian ministers, Pat Robertson. In the audience, chuckling with the rest of us, was the head of the Muslim Council of Britain, Iqbal Sakrani. But his smirk folded into a pout at the first glimpse of a cartoon that ridiculed Muslim clerics. The point being this: equal treatment, offending everybody, may cause offense, but it need not signify oppression, let alone Islamophobia. And this brings me then back to the issue of the ploy. Not always, but again, in my own experience, I can attest that what many Muslims will say as discussions, really in order to, as a part of these discussions, in order to curtail the discussion as soon as possible, they will say, I feel hurt. I feel victimized. I'm being violated. And I think there's a very simple principle that we all need to remember. Very simple. That disagreeing with one another's ideas does not mean denying each other's humanity. Exactly the opposite, in fact. If I did not see you as a peer, as an equal, as somebody worth engaging with, why would I waste my precious energy and time? I'd leave you alone. Because, you know, you're going to melt under the spotlight of my scrutiny anyway, right? After all, back to the earlier point I made, you're just a child. But when we actually engage with one another by asking the uncomfortable questions, and yet, yes, making statements that we know will make folks bristle, but doing it, again, for reasons of continuing the discussion and deepening the discussion, then I believe what we are showing is the kind of respect that says, you are my peer. And that's why I'm taking the time. Not just to try and teach you where I'm coming from, but obviously to tease out from you what your issues with democratic dialogue are.
You know, Irshad, I so strongly agree with that. I'm struggling to disagree.
And I hear a butt coming on.
I'm struggling to disagree. But let me try again. Because you said en passant there, disagreeing with one another's ideas.
Yeah.
So is it your position really that a debate about or depiction of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, Muslims, is really totally comparable with the debate about, I don't know, Darwinism or conservatism or whatever it may be? In other words, it's essentially it is on the same plane. It's a debate about ideas.
Let me say this, Tim. Of course, it's not in reality on the same plane because of the way so many Muslims treat, you know, that debate or that discussion. But there is no reason that it should not be on the same plane.
But in whose reality? Yours or Mark Thompson's? Because what Mark was trying to say, and it's really quite an interesting and deep point, is that for him, as a devout Christian, in his reality, his deep reality, it's different. It really is different whether we're debating, you know, conservatism, socialism, and Darwinism, or these things that I, in my inner self...
Part of his felt experience, as he emphasized. Yes, but let's also remember, he emphasized as well that if he does not want to be offended by anything, and he senses that that is about to come down the road through, let's say, a television program, you know, that's on the telly, he would simply change the channel.
Right. Or
shut the television set off.
Right. Right.
And he made the point, actually, that that is the best way to counter. So I believe that if he's trying to justify what this other university professor called the murderous rage of Muslims, if he's trying to justify that by giving it a pass, by giving it an excuse, he's just contradicted himself right there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that would be fair to his position.
No, I'm saying
I mean,
if that's what he's doing, you know, by sort of understanding where this rage comes from, and why, therefore, among other reasons, we as the BBC would not air any program that mocks Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah, and you're so right, and there is a lot of that about it. It's important to say there's a lot of respect which is actually lined with fear.
That's right.
I mean, that's precisely
and also, frankly, lined with low expectations.
Yeah.
This is what I find so disrespectful about the respect, so-called, of many contemporary liberals of various skin colors, by the way. Don't for a minute think I'm talking about just white liberals, okay? Is that it is precisely because in their heart of hearts they expect little more than violence from Muslims, that they will often hold the torch of nobility and say, in order to be sensitive, we will not go there, right? I'll give you a classic example of why this is such a sham, and it's not even necessary. Low expectations. Again, back to my fellow Muslims. I'm often accused of feeding Islamophobia. And when Muslims and non-Muslims are part of the same audience that I'm speaking to, very often a Muslim in the audience will say, Irshad, I agree with everything that you're saying. I think it is important to get these ideas out. The problem is that non-Muslims will not understand where you're coming from and will walk away with a more negative image of Islam than they've already got. And I say, every time this has happened, I say, okay, let's put your low expectations of non-Muslims to the test. And I, on the spot, do a survey and literally beseech non-Muslims in the audience not to be kind to me, not to try and protect me, but to be upfront and honest. Are you walking away from tonight's event with a negative image of Islam, or a more negative image than you came in with? Hands up. In an audience of a few hundred, 2, 3 maximum, hands will go up. Then I say, remember, you're not doing me any favors if you're trying to protect me. Okay. How many of you will be walking away with a more positive image? And those who care to sort of vote, the vast majority of those hands go up. Now, that's not to say I'm right, they're wrong, game over. It is to point out that in this very emotionally raw discussion about Islam, about identity, about minorities, and therefore about how far can we go to push free speech and free expression, we, as Muslims and non-Muslims, often come to each other with high defenses about the other and low expectations of ourselves. Okay, and we need to turn that around. We need to have higher expectations of ourselves, first and foremost, and lower defenses about the other. And that does mean treating one another not as labels endowed with the baggage of their parents, as if the past defines the present, but rather treating one another as individuals endowed, and this is the person, the person of faith coming out in me, endowed with the capacity for self-reflection and personal growth. I don't see why that's unreasonable, incidentally.
I wouldn't dream of suggesting it was unreasonable. No, that's fascinating. I mean, let me just open up one area which goes straight off that, and then I'm going to throw it open for debate, which is, you said the ploy is. So just tell us briefly whose ploy.
Right. Great question. By ploy, I mean, well, let's put it into context. When I used the word ploy, I meant this notion that we are so hurt as Muslims that you are further, undermining our dignity, our inherent dignity as human beings, when you raise these questions or make these statements or draw these sketches. And the question then becomes, as you asked earlier, well, who's we? See, what I find, again, revealing and troubling is that those of us right across the political spectrum who wish to be constructive, as we are also being, liberal in our approach to life, we tend to treat community leaders as actual leaders rather than the misleaders that they more often are. we give them the power to speak on behalf of all kinds of people, and we allow them to arrogate to themselves the power to dictate which customs, traditions, and ideas are untouchable. What we rarely ask, and this is, by the way, a question that most academics who deal in these issues also have failed to ask, is what do we do with those individuals, or about, or even for those individuals within minority communities who are being oppressed by the community leaders? What do we do with the minorities within those minorities, the people who have different ideas, the people who are unorthodox, the individuals who do wish to express their individuality rather than merely their group identity? Because remember, no matter what group you belong to or set of groups you belong to, you never stop being an individual unto yourself within those groups as well.
This is a point that Kenan Malik has made very eloquently and
That's
often
right.
about this country.
That's right.
Last quick question, and then I'll throw it open. Because clearly you're talking mainly about the debate within North America and Europe, or the West broadly. If we're talking about community leaders and misleaders, we're talking about self-appointed Muslim community leaders in a country like
Britain.
Britain.
Reinforcing their self-appointed power with our silence.
Or indeed by the state sometimes,
Yeah,
or by local
that's right,
authorities.
that's
so,
right.
so we're talking about that context. Very broad question. Do you feel that the debate inside Muslim communities in the West, if we can generalize, is going in the right direction and going in your direction?
Here's the thing, Tim, there are many debates percolating among Muslims all over the world.
So which are going the right and which the wrong?
Well, no, it's actually, I think debate in and of itself is right. I think that the idea that, previous untouchables, previously non-negotiable ideas, principles, rituals are now up for discussion. That in and of itself is, in my view, going in the right direction. I'm not interested. As a liberal, I am absolutely not interested in expunging fundamentalists from my world. Not at all. I mean, I could not be a liberal, a self-respecting liberal, and want everybody to agree with me. That is not what a liberal is. So, diversity of opinion and thought and viewpoint, I value that. To the point where I invite disagreement, as surely I will get some, this evening. I hope I do. But the point is that what we cannot do, and this is so simple it hardly needs, stating, but for the record, let me state it. What we cannot do is impose or force our viewpoints on others. Okay. So the right to be a fundamentalist stops at the point in which you intimidate, bully, harass, or otherwise coerce somebody else to adopt your viewpoint simply because you think it's right. I will tell you that for me, being a faithful Muslim is all about recognizing that there is only one God, and that community leaders are not that. The job is not open. They need not apply. Okay? And that as a result of there being only one God that we are to worship, the spiritual duty of Muslims becomes building societies in which we can disagree with one another in peace and with civility, because anything less means that we're playing God with one another. And that actually, if to the degree that I feel comfortable sort of declaring anything a sin, that to me is the central sin within Islam. So the delicious paradox here is, and that's what Allah, Liberty, and Love is based upon, the delicious paradox here is that by devoting ourselves to one God, we oblige ourselves to defend human liberty. This is why I make the distinction between faith and dogma. Faith is secure enough to handle questions. Faith never needs to be threatened by questions. Dogma, by contrast, is always threatened by questions, because dogma, by definition, is rigid and brittle and it snaps under the spotlight of scrutiny.